Hello, today I'm going to be talking to you about Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. This was first published in 1719 and it is widely known as the first English novel, or one of the first English novels. It's about a guy called Robinson Crusoe that gets shipwrecked on an island for 28 years and escapes. And that may sound like a spoiler to you, but literally on the first page it has "The life and strange surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe, blah 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 blah. He was at last strangely delivered by pirates." So this man wanted to be a sailor. He ends up in the Brazils, which I guess is just Brazil, and owning a plantation, and then he's on this trip to Africa to basically take more slaves, and they get shipwrecked, and he is the only person that survives, but the ship is still there, so he manages to take everything that's useful from the ship onto the land, and that is what he kind of starts with to try and build his life. So most of the first half of the book is him just kind of finding ways to exist on this island in terms of building shelter and cultivating crops and finding companionship. And I've got to say, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would, to be honest. I really liked it, especially like the latter third where things got really exciting. It was pretty gripping. Context for the rest of this review: there are two reasons why I decided to read this book. One was because one of the main characters in the Moonstone continually references it, and it's like his solace as he goes back to reading Robinson Crusoe. And the other is this TV show by a guy named Kevin MacLeod, who is a UK TV presenter. He does the show called Grand Designs about building houses, and he made this TV show called Kevin MacLeod's Man-Made Home, and in it he built like a little house out of entirely sustainable and local materials, and he constantly referenced oh, it's like I'm Robinson Crusoe. So I was really looking forward to literally just him building his house. Although it's really well described how he does a lot of those things, it's quite hard to visualize, but you know, it's enough. Also, isn't this edition just gorgeous? It is a Penguin English Library edition, so it's got the rubberized cover because I bought it a while ago, and it's one of the, there are only a handful of them that don't have a repeating pattern on the front, and I think this is just beautiful. Now on to the meat of this video. So obviously this book was written a long fucking time ago, and it has some flaws with that. Namely that the language is just old and spelt differently. It's just quite hard to read. I will give you an example by flicking to a random page and reading a sentence. "The fear of being swallowed up alive made me that I never slept in quiet, and yet the apprehension of lying abroad without any fence was almost equal to it." All of those words make sense, but that's just not how we would use it currently, so it just makes for quite slow reading. I feel like if you don't know English that well, if it's your second language or something, this would be a really hard book to get through. And it also has just a lot of strange formatting. There's no chapters, it is just continuous, and the way, there isn't much dialogue in it, but when there is dialogue, it's just done in line and italicized, and it's just quite confusing to figure out who's talking. It also breaks a lot of normal rules of books. It goes through everything he does in the first 10 days, and then it shows you what he's written in his diary for the first 10 days, and it's just a complete repetition. What is the point of that? But by it not sticking to those rules, because the rules didn't exist yet, I guess, it was oddly refreshing. There weren't any narrative expectations. You'd think it was going one way, but you couldn't guarantee it. It just could go off in a completely different direction. And it did a lot. So that was quite fun. It was difficult to read, but decent payoff. Now let's talk about religion. I don't like talking about religion, and when I opened this book, I expected there to be quite a lot of religious references, because when it is talked about in the Moonstone, it's always as Robinson Crusoe was the perfect Christian kind of thing. At the start of the book, he's not very religious at all, and at a certain point into his life on the island, he basically decides that it's by God's grace that he has lived, he's been saved from the shipwreck instead of God's evilness that made the shipwreck happen in the first place. But then the way it talks about religion, and he happens to have a Bible, so he's reading all the time, it's very unquestioning, it's very preachy, it's very dogmatic, it's very much when he starts talking to another person and trying to convert them into Christianity, it's oh yes, this is the way. I just found that aspect quite boring, to be honest. Now it's time for me to talk about Utopia and Dystopia, because literally in every book I read I want to talk about this. So you're stranding on a desert island. You want to leave. That's the goal. The goal is survival and then exit. But if you're there for 28 years, you kind of get to a point where that is your life. And not only are you just coping, you've built it, you've you've built your life around how you want it to be. So at a certain point, for Robinson Crusoe, it's the new normal, and it's the perfect life for him. I have a quote. "I was removed from all the wickedness of the world here. I had neither the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, or the pride of life. I had nothing to covet, for I had all that I was now capable of enjoying. I was lord of the whole manor, or if I pleased I might call myself king, or emperor of the whole country which I had possession of. There were no rivals, I had no competitor, none to dispute my sovereignty or command with me." So at that point he's achieved a level of autonomy, which is very comfortable. Apart from, I have a quote. "In all the time of my solitary life, I never felt so earnest, so strong a desire after the society of my fellow creatures, or so deep a regret at the want of it." He's really just lacking interaction. At the start of the book he has a dog for some reason, but then he has like parrots, and he teaches parrots to speak, and it's just, it doesn't say anything in the text really about how fucking sad that is, but it's really sad. Now we're going to talk about slavery. Yeah, I don't feel like I have any authority to talk about slavery, but here we go. This was written in a time of plantations, of the slave trade, and it was about plantations a lot of the time. Robinson Crusoe was literally stranded on the way to make a slave run, and I don't think that this is like a really progressive commentary on that. I think that just that's how it was at the time. It seems from this book like it was so ingrained in the white people that they had ownership over other humans, and it's also really ingrained in the servants, in the subservient class, that they deserve to be there. "My people were perfectly subjected. I was absolute lord and lawgiver. They all owed their lives to me, and were ready to lay down their lives, if there had been occasion of it, for me." That's really the thing that struck me about the presentation of like slavery and the idea of owning people, was that at this time it seems like it was just so normal, and it's like a first-hand account of how normal and accepted it is, and that's very strange. Great, nailed it. Right, so the next controversial topic is trauma. I tend to, or I do recently, dog-ear the pages at the bottom with something. It tends to be the title of the book, like where it's mentioned. For this, I decided from the start I would dog-ear when Robinson Crusoe starts talking to himself or references addressing himself. Because I was like, oh, that'll just be a slow descent into madness, it'll be really interesting. But I literally have 3 dog-ears. There are barely any implications of the psychological trauma that Robinson Crusoe would have to have gone through in this book. And you'd expect that if it was written these days, that's what the whole book would be about. It would be about their mental health and the breakdown and where they find strength. And in this book, although there are some references to like religion, there isn't much in terms of like mental health at all. And thus we come to a very unpopular opinion of mine, and that is that in the modern climate of our sensitivity to mental health, I think that it makes people less resilient to things if they can be categorized as afflictions. That is not me saying I don't think mental health is important, or I don't think people's mental health issues are important. I'm just saying that like our awareness of it gives us more scope to like attribute things to certain oh, it's biologically I was predisposed to this thing, and that may be the right way. I'm saying that Robinson Crusoe didn't have the opportunity to be like, oh, I'm depressed. He just had to fucking get on with life. He didn't have any alternative because there wasn't a good frame of reference for mental health issues. Does that make sense? The obvious rebuttal to that is that this is all fiction, but it was based on a true story of a man called Alexander Selkirk who survived 4 years off the coast of Peru on a random island, and it was voluntary. He was on a ship and they stopped at this island, and he was like, we need to do major repairs on the ship or it is gonna break. And the captain was like, no, and he was like, I'm gonna take my chances on this island instead of get back on that ship. And then eventually the ship actually did wreck, and he was picked up 4 years later by another ship. It's an interesting story, look it up. My point is that in that true story, there hasn't been any evidence of psychological implications. He continued on as a sailor for literally the rest of his life. I just think it bears thinking about. I have fairly good mental health. The one problem I guess I'd say I suffer with is anxiety, and a lot of the time I will make an excuse for, you know, not doing something. It's like, because I'm anxious about this thing, and therefore I need to take these steps to feel better. It's just interesting, like, if I didn't have that excuse, if I didn't say to myself, it's okay, you just have a bit of anxiety, you're really anxious at the moment, you know, treat yourself this way. If I didn't have that, what would I do instead? Would I actually manage to be more productive? Again, not trying to insult anyone, not saying ignore mental health issues. It was just interesting to see the lack of trauma in this book. So this has been Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon for another one. Bye. P.S. I was wrong. This is technically historical fiction, actually, because although it was published in 1719, the actual, like, shipwrecking took place in 1660. So maybe the whole slave trade thing could be slightly retrospective. It was still definitely going on in 1719, but maybe how people saw it was slightly different. I'm not sure. I don't know. It wasn't around then. But little correction, sorry.